I wanted to go over the V10 era in Formula 1, something that a lot of people from my generation, i.e. millennials, or even some older people who were around at the time, definitely look back upon with potentially rose-tinted glasses. Was it as good as what we make it out to be? Is Formula 1 now markedly worse than what it was back in the day? Well, I'm going to go through this because there's a lot to cover when it comes to this. And again, younger viewers or people that were not into Formula 1 back then probably won't know what the V10 era was. It's something that, you know, it's just a time period in Formula 1 of around 10 years or so, but a lot of people might not even be aware of it if they've come in after Drive to Survive or have only ever known the V6 turbocharged engines in Formula 1. And the main question I'm going to ask is, was it as good as what people make it out to be? Is it overblown? Is it overrated? Or was this truly the greatest era in Formula 1 racing? Well, I'm going to go over this as best as I can today, guys, here on the F1Chronicle.com. So, something that I think is very interesting when it comes to the V10 era, which let's just define what that was, of course, first before we go too in depth with this. Basically, the V10 era quite literally was between 1996 and 2005 when the entire grid raced V10 engines. Now, of course, nowadays we have V6 turbocharged engines, and in between the V10s and the V6s there was the V8s. But most people, when they think of the V10 era, I think anyway, or when they're harkening back to those days, they kind of focus on 2000 to 2004, and I'll get into why that is exactly very shortly as well in this video. But I think that is the specific time period that a lot of people do harken back to when they think about this. Obviously, the V10 engines were in the Formula 1 cars in the late 90s as well. V10 engines were in Formula 1 even before 1996 as well. It's only after 1995 when we saw the last V12 engine, the Ferrari V12, be taken out of the car after that point. So from 96 onwards, that is the V10 era in my opinion. Now, like I said, they kind of harken back to those days of 2000 to 2004, and there's a few reasons why they do this, and the biggest reason really I think is because of Michael Schumacher. Schumacher won every single title between 2000 and 2004, and this for me is a little bit of a negative really. I'm not saying that Schumacher's a bad thing for Formula 1, let me just explain my reasonings for that, because at the end of the day it's competition, and this is one of the negatives really when I think about the comparison between nowadays in Formula 1, the current era, and of course the era in the V10s. And yeah, Schumacher and Ferrari were the absolute dream team at this point. They were unstoppable. The likes of Ross Brawn and Jean Todt, they just made that team work so well. They were unstoppable, winning every single drivers and constructors title every year between 2000 and 2004. It was something else. It was incredible to behold. They were an absolute winning machine. In my opinion, I think I would say that they were even more dominant than what Mercedes were in the V6 era, at the start of that era anyway. But that's just my opinion. It's quite subjective as to what you think was actually more dominant or less. But honestly, the margins that Ferrari had during that time was unbelievable. And you know, we've got to talk about the competitiveness of things. Now, of course, in 2000, there was a great battle between Schumacher and Hakkinen for the championship, which Schumacher won. And in 2003 as well, it was also quite a close battle, a three-way battle really, between Schumacher, Kimi Räikkönen in the McLaren, and also Juan Pablo Montoya in the Williams. And Räikkönen and Schumacher went all the way to the final round to battle it out at Suzuka, just like Kimi Räikkönen's compatriot Hakkinen did 3 years prior. Now, those were great, of course. Those were great seasons, in my opinion. Some of the all-time greats, for sure. But it's a bit of, it's looking back upon these that I think is quite interesting, because in between that you've got 2001, 2002 and 2004 where Schumacher just absolutely blew the competition away, to the point in 2002 where Ferrari actually scored as many points in the Constructors' Championship as all the other 9 or 10 teams combined that year. Now, of course, this was a different era. It was a shorter season, and we also had only the top 6 scoring points. But for the following year in 2003, the top 8 scored points. And I don't think that's a coincidence in terms of changing the point structure, because Ferrari are just so dominant. Now, you can say that this is a problem with Formula 1 in general, with one team just being that good. You could argue that it's something to do with the V10 era that just really suited Ferrari. I would say I'm kind of on the fence a little bit with it, because at the end of the day, Formula 1 usually does have a dominant team. It's rare that we have a bunch of teams battling it out for the Constructors' Championship. As much as we like to think it's something that happens a lot, it really isn't. What we saw in 2024 was rare. 2021 we had a really close battle, but 22, 23, absolute domination by Red Bull, and then Mercedes all the way from 2014 to 2020, 7 years in a row. We had that too. So you could definitely argue that this is something we've seen before, the V10 era being one team really good and all the other teams trying to play catch up, and we've seen that in the V6 as well. But I would say on the balance of things, it's probably around the same. You do normally get one team dominating in Formula 1. You had Williams in bits of the 90s, you had McLaren in parts of the 80s and 90s as well. It's not uncommon at all. Go even further back than that, you get Brabham in there, you get Ferrari, Lotus. It's something that's always been present in Formula 1. So I wouldn't say necessarily that is really worse for the actual V10 era. Saying that the V10 era was way better during this time, I think is a little misguided on that front at least. Now, let's talk about overtakes. Something that Formula 1 is always trying to do is trying to make it more easy for drivers to overtake. Drivers are always complaining about not being able to get past. That's why we have DRS, and we'll talk about DRS as well. But at the end of the day, when we look at the stats, it does actually paint a very interesting picture in terms of overtakes. Overall nowadays, the overtakes throughout a Grand Prix are far higher than in the V10 era. It is a massive difference. It's anywhere between 2 and 4 times as many overtakes throughout a race in Formula 1 these days than what it was around 20 years ago or before. Now, what's the reason for this? Is it the cars, or is it because of the rules? Well, I firmly believe actually this is something to do with the rules. Now, personally for me, we did see a lot of cars struggling to overtake, but the key was really in the V10 era is that most cars would do their overtaking through the pits. Now, the stats that I've tried to find the actual graphic that goes over this, but it's very illustrative of the problem, but I found another graph that does go over it in terms of overtakes. This only counts on-track overtakes. Now, an on-track overtake typically is when a car passes another car around the circuit at some point, and therefore they are ahead at the finish line on the following lap than what they were previously. So let's just say P9 overtakes P8, they're positioned at some point around the lap. They do this on lap 15. On lap 16, when it's actually starting, that is counted as an overtake. So a lot of the overtaking was actually done through the pits because of refueling. Now, refueling is something that has been banned since the end of the 2009 season on a number of different reasons for this, the safety grounds being a big one for this. And refueling was present in Formula 1 between 1994 and 2009. If you look at the graphic, it absolutely spikes after 2009. But there is another factor to this, of course, as well. And that other factor is DRS. Like I mentioned before, the drag reduction system makes it easier to overtake. Now, the DRS was not in play in 2010, which I think is quite telling for this graph, because again, if you look at it in 2010, that is the highest number of on-track overtakes compared to any time during the V10 era, when the graph starts in 1994. And that's not a coincidence. Now, of course, it spikes up even higher in 2011, 2012 when DRS first introduced, and therefore more cars are able to overtake. Now, that does mean, in theory, you get more entertaining races, but are the races actually better nowadays? Well, I'm actually in quite a unique position to talk about this, because I went back years ago, and I actually watched a lot of races from this era, and I'll tell you why. Because I just used to watch all the races back then in the V10 era. I watched every race, I probably watched every race live, or pretty much every race live, since 2007. So after the V10 era actually ended. Now, I've actually gone back, and I've watched a lot of these races from 2004, 2003, 2002. And don't get me wrong, there are some gems in there. There are some absolutely fantastic races in there, particularly in the more exciting seasons like 2003. But oh my days, are there some terrible races as well. You go back and watch some of these races. The 2004 Malaysian Grand Prix, the 2002 European Grand Prix, for example, or I'm just giving random races out here, but honestly, you go back and you watch some of these races and they are terrible. It is just Schumacher walking away with it at the front of the field for the most part. Maybe Barrichello scrapping it out with Montoya or Raikkonen or somebody like that for second place, but it is largely a race for second place, if that. You know, Ferrari just went to every track pretty much and absolutely bossed it, particularly in the case of Michael Schumacher. So I would say on the whole, nowadays, there are a lot better races on the whole. Now, there are some classic races from back then. There's some classic races now. There are some bad races now. There were some bad races back then. But honestly, without actually going through every single race and giving it all a ranking, which would take me weeks upon weeks of research, and even then, it is a very subjective thing, what makes a good Grand Prix, and that's something else I'm going to get onto as well. But when it comes to actually, you know, watching these races and stuff, I would say, on the whole balance of things, Formula 1 in general nowadays has less bad races. I feel like the bad races nowadays are not actually as bad as the bad races back then, if you follow what I'm saying. So a bad race nowadays might be a 3 or a 4 out of 10. Back then, you're talking about a 2 out of 10. Honestly, they were terrible, a lot of them. Some of them great, of course, all-time classic. Some of them absolutely dog doo-doo to watch. A waste of an hour and a half, in my opinion. Honestly, you barely see any on-track overtakes. It's all through the pits, which is not exciting. But DRS, is DRS exciting? Well, this is the thing. You can have more overtakes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you get a better race. What dry race holds the record for the most on-track overtakes of all time? Have a think. I bet you won't know. And if you do know, you're probably a nerd like me that just knows this fact. But it's the 2016 Chinese Grand Prix. Now, why do I highlight this? Well, this is in the modern era. This is under the DRS time, so it was easy to overtake. And you also have a great big long straight for people to overtake round the back. Now, was this a great race? It was pretty good. You know, I enjoyed watching it at the time. Kvyat and Vettel having their torpedo moment. Hamilton struggling at the back. Ricciardo doing some fantastic overtakes. I actually remember this quite well because of the anomaly that it was in terms of actually going back and watching it. But who won the race? Nico Rosberg won the race by about 40 seconds. This is not an all-time classic. You would think that if overtakes equals better racing, then the best race of all time should be, statistically, the best race in terms of who got the most overtakes, how many overtakes there were during a Grand Prix. That is not the case. That is not the case. Look at NASCAR, right? I like NASCAR. I think it's entertaining, but I don't watch NASCAR live because it takes so long. If you actually watch an entire NASCAR race, it's a good 3, 4, 5 hours of your life that you're never going to get back for the most part because it's fun. Don't get me wrong. I like it, but a lot of casual motorsport fans do not like it because you get around 3 hours of that 4 hours where nothing really happens in terms of actually meaning something for the championship. It's broken up into stages now, but I'm talking about back in the day before it was actually broken up into stages. It was not entertaining for like the first 3 or so hours because there were loads of overtakes that just meant nothing. It didn't mean anything. You could just be anywhere in the race and win it by the end. That was kind of what happened for the most part. So overtaking does not necessarily equal a better race. It helps, of course. It's what you want to see. You want to see drivers battling and fighting each other for these positions. But lots of overtakes to a point, if you just see them all the time, lap after lap after lap, the entire field overtaking each other, you're just numb to it. It's boring. It's repetitive. Just in the same way cars going round a track, not overtaking is repetitive as well. So that's part of it as well. You know, there's a lot to it in terms of whether you think it's better or not. And less overtakes in that era might not necessarily be a bad thing, but I certainly don't think it's a good thing. I don't think many people will actually agree, you know, actually think that it is a good thing or not. Now, again, let's talk about the tyres. This is another thing. And again, it depends on your perspective as to whether this is a good thing or not. Tyres back in these days were actually grooved. They had grooves cut through them to try and limit the performance of the cars, which again, a lot of nerds like me might be like, oh wow, these cars, imagine if they had tyres like nowadays. How fast would they be? Well, they'd just be faster, of course, obviously. But, you know, the tyres are a controversial one. Think of Tiregate for one. Now, the Tiregate saga is something I've already covered on this channel a long time ago. I think I covered it before the United States Grand Prix last season. So go check it out if you've not already. Going into the reasons for that. But basically, back then, there was no single tyre supplier. Now, like we have nowadays with Pirelli. Back then, there were 2 different tyre suppliers, Bridgestone and Michelin. Now, the teams flip-flopped in terms of who actually supplied their tyres, depending on the time and when it was. But basically, because most of the grid in 2005 for the US Grand Prix was supplied by Michelin, who supplied a tyre that unfortunately was not safe to race, that meant that most of the field could not race. Now, this is a very extreme example, of course, but it's a negative in a sense because you've got 2 tyre suppliers that are supplying different tyres. Therefore, other tyre manufacturers, other cars will really struggle just purely because of the tyres they've got on, which again, some people might think, well, there's more variety there. And I do get that. I understand that, but it obviously came to a head with the Tyregate scandal. And on top of that as well, it also means that there's less of a level playing field. Something I want to talk about in terms of the cost cap as well. Now, there's been talk of a cost cap in Formula 1 for over 20 years before it was actually implemented. It was talked about during Moses' time as FIA president, but it never got through. Now, basically, up until the cost cap was introduced, teams could just spend whatever they wanted on the team. There was no limit on it whatsoever. You want to put $1 billion in, go ahead, mate. If you got it, spend it, 100%. Nowadays, it's different. I think you get $145 million per season, which is going to be increased around $200 million for 2026. But even then, even with that kind of spending, obviously in Formula 1, it's just, yeah, you do get these guys that actually, kind of bunching up a little bit. We've seen this. 2024, the top teams are actually quite close to one another. And their overall closeness because of the level playing field. The engines are pretty much level. The tyres are exactly the same. There's no refueling. It's the drivers actually become more of a differentiating factor, in my opinion. But I think back in the V10 days, it wasn't quite the case. It wasn't quite the case in terms of the performance of the cars. Again, like I go back to what Ferrari did. The same amount of points in 2002 as the rest of the grid combined. 9-10 teams combined. That's just ludicrous how they did that. But they did it because they were great. They were the best team and they won. And yes, the best team should win. The best team should win. That is what Formula 1 should be. The best team that makes the best car with the best drivers should win. That is just what it is, right? That is no different to any other sport. And in fact, in Formula 1, because you've got different cars, that does mean that the driver is not always a differentiating factor. But I feel like with the cost cap back then, it not being a thing back then, I should say, we saw teams just win because they spent the most money. And that is something that's always been a part in Formula 1 to an extent. There have been exceptions. Toyota, of course, during this time, spent a lot of money and got pretty much no success for it. Not a single win to their name. But having things like the tyres being different, I would not say that is potentially a good thing. I mean, it does allow more development, of course, but, having tyres that never really wear out as well as was the case back then, is that a good thing? Do we want to see that? Well, this is actually a positive. I would personally say that because we had things like the refueling back then, the tyres were not a differentiating factor in terms of their tyre wear. Tyre performance is different to tyre wear. The tyres back then basically would do the entire race if you just raced flat out. And because drivers, usually pit stop to do a 2 or a 3 stop, maybe in some cases, I think Schumacher famously did a 4-stop race in France in 2004 and still won, he did. I feel like the actual, the tyres being so hard and not wearing down was actually kind of a good thing for the racing, because what it meant is that you had teams and drivers that could just push 100% every single lap, flat out racing. And that's what we want to see. Now, in Formula 1 nowadays, we don't see that as much. The fuel has to be limited. The tyres have to be looked after. It's very rare you see a driver during a Grand Prix going flat out 100%. You only see it during qualifying. And by the way, qualifying nowadays, a million times better than it used to be in the V10 era. Back then, used to either have, depending on the actual year we're talking about, used to have an hour session where you can come out at any point, and those hour sessions, basically first 20-30 minutes. And yes, again, before anybody says it, I have gone back and watched these because I love listening to Murray Walker and Martin Brundle. But if you don't really care about their commentary, in terms of on-track action, you wouldn't see any for 20-30 minutes at the start of the session. You can pretty much fast forward it, skip it out, make some tea, have a cup of tea or something, chill out, do what you want to do. There was nothing on track happening, literally nothing. 1 or 2 drivers, maybe like a Minardi would go out for some sponsorship time or something. That's kind of it. So qualifying now is far better. And even then, we had things like one shot, we had things like the aggregate qualifying system in 2005, I want to say. They were not as good. Qualifying now is far better than what it used to be. That is undeniable in my opinion. Even the most ardent V10 supporters will admit that the qualifying was crap back then compared to what we had now. But of course, different fuel loads and stuff for the race added a bit of variety. That is one positive I will give it. But yeah, having 100%, these guys pushing 100% every single lap is what we want to see in Formula 1, and what I hope to see some more in 2026 as well, but we'll see what happens with that. But the main positive for me, and one of the most nostalgic things for most people who remember that era, the sound. I'm going to play you a sound clip of a Formula 1 engine now. And now I'm going to play you a sound clip of a Formula 1 engine from the V10 era. It's not even close, is it? you know, it's just not even close. It's not fair. It's not fair. The V10s, they have 4 more cylinders, as the name suggests. They were ran to nearly 20, I think they actually go over 20,000 RPM. Nowadays, the engines are limited to 15,000, but in reality, they will do 11, 12,000 RPM because of fuel saving and also the durability that these engines need to have. And some of the positives when it comes to the overall design of these cars is that, honestly, I feel like they looked better as well back then. They were a lot less wide. Because of that, you could argue that they were definitely easier to overtake too. The aerodynamics were a lot simpler. I feel like the overall look of these Formula 1 cars definitely was better back then than what it is now. Now, it's impressive, of course, the downforce levels that the cars nowadays can achieve, but really when it comes to looks, you only really care in terms of how much these cars actually look. You wouldn't rather put a picture of a Ferrari F2004, for example, on the wall than maybe an RB20. Now, not to slag off Red Bull, you could apply that to any of the cars on the grid in recent times, but personally, I know which one I'd rather have on. Cars as well were a lot cheaper as well to design, particularly when it comes to the engines. Now, Formula 1 teams, particularly Ferrari back then, were definitely pouring a lot of money into their enterprise, but when it comes to the engines, just being a simple V10 was definitely better in terms of the overall cost of it, and that's something that can't be ignored. It was probably easier to enter as a privateer back then, but that being said, the V10s was definitely the era when a lot of these small teams just went completely out of business. Jordan died after 2005, Arrows after 2002, Minardi became Toro Rosso for the 2006 season, so I can see why the nostalgia is there in terms of the teams that from your childhood that you loved. You know, it was the last time when they were on the grid, but the sad reality is that unfortunately this era that you sometimes associate with them, that was the era when they were really struggling to survive, and in fact eventually didn't survive, and that is a big thing. And I feel like people are looking back on rose tinted glasses because they'll see the highlights, these classic highlights these days that are coming onto YouTube. Back in my day, it was a lot tougher. You had to go to the F1archives.com or the old BBC Sport website or something like that to actually watch them, which, don't worry, I did. I've done my time. I've spent thousands of hours probably watching old sessions and stuff in Formula 1 back in the day. I had so much time on my hand. No chance I can do that now. But, you know, I feel like people are looking back in rose-tinted spectacles. I really do. This isn't me bashing the V10 era. This isn't me saying it was bad, it was boring, it was a good time in Formula 1. There were a lot of things back then that were better, you know. I feel, and the sport was simpler, you know. It was more accessible. You didn't have social media, so you didn't have these idiots on Twitter because Twitter didn't exist, or X, or whatever it's known as nowadays. You know, I do miss that. I miss free-to-air Formula 1. I miss a time before social media. Even though social media is part of what I do as a job these days, I don't like it particularly. I'll do it for my job, but I don't like it, and I don't like some of the people on there, for sure. And of course, there's always been an element of that. There's always been idiots that follow sports. Of course, people who take it too far. That's what they do. But I do think, overall, people are looking back at rose-tinted glasses. I do feel like it's a bit overblown. And you'll get the same thing. The people from Gen X, the people born in the 60s or 70s, right? They will look back upon Formula 1 in the 1980s and say that was the best. You will get really old people in the 80s, 90s years old now, looking back on the 50s and 60s and saying that was the best time in Formula 1. Why? Because they were young. Life was simpler. Life in general was simpler. So people always look back on this time very fondly. I look back on football in the same way. Early 2000s, late 90s. Love it. Absolutely love it. But go back and watch the games. Football has changed so much. So has Formula 1. Some people say for the better, some people say for the worse. Some things are better, some things are worse. But overall, the V10 era was far from perfect. And I have gone on about this for a very long time. I really hope you enjoyed my points in this one, guys. I've tried to go into as many different aspects as I can when it comes to competitiveness, the performance, the sound, the format of Formula 1, the overall world as a whole, because the world as a whole was simpler back then. And I look back at that time and think, man, I wish I could go back. But everybody says that about every time when they were young. It's just simple as that. just experience it for a bit. But you actually go back and watch the things that you watched. You play that old video game. You watch maybe that old movie that you loved. And maybe it's not the same anymore because you have changed. It hasn't. But your memories of it will always be more fond. You remember the good stuff. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I've literally just sat down and ranted to the camera for like nearly 25 minutes here. You know, if you're watching this on Patreon, thank you. Honestly, thank you. You would have seen this a few days earlier compared to Microsoft and YouTube and the other free platforms as well. I really, really hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed doing some research for this as well. And yeah, you know, I want to hear your thoughts. Am I right about the V10 era? Is it overrated? Is it overrated? I'm not sitting here and saying that Formula 1 is better now, but there's definitely some things that are better. And overall, if to my head, I have to choose. Genuinely, I'd probably choose F1 now. I really would. I really would. And this has come from someone who's watched a lot of Formula 1. How many hours does it take to become an expert? 10,000. I must be getting close to that. I've got to be on at least 6-7K by now, I reckon. But yeah, your thoughts in the comments below, guys. I really appreciate all your support as always. Like, share, comment, subscribe as always. And of course, like I said, this is a Patreon exclusive for a little bit. I'll put it on the YouTube membership thing as well. Substack as well. If you want to go support us financially, you get some bonuses, like I said. Like being able to see content like this early too. And yeah, have a great day. Have a great week. Have a great evening. See you very soon, guys. Have a good one.